Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session. Thank you, František, for this nice introduction. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to the idea of null models in network neuroscience. So my name is František Váša. I'm based at King's College London. Before I begin, can I just have a quick show of hands? Can you raise your hand if you currently use or have used network neuroscience approaches in your work? Quite a few. Okay, thank you. Can you raise your hand if you haven't used these approaches yet, but plan to in the future? Okay, thanks. And if you haven't used them and don't intend to, then this might not be that relevant, but actually some of the later talks apply to forms of data other than just networks, other than just connectomes. So hopefully there's something to learn for everyone. So I'm going to introduce network neuroscience briefly using this very nice diagram by Rick Betzel and Danny Bassett, and really to showcase the dimensions and scales that these tools apply to. So we can use these approaches to study organization of neural systems across a range of spatial scales, from individual cells to whole brains. We can study changes across a range of temporal scales, from kind of fast dynamics at the millisecond level all the way through to very slow changes across evolutionary timescales. And we have network measures that allow us to capture connectivity across a range of topological scales, or scales of network organization, from the local level of individual nodes and edges all the way through to whole brain networks. Also a reminder that the key to this endeavor is the connectivity matrix, which summarizes connections between all pairs of nodes in a system. Rows and columns correspond to nodes. The entries correspond to associations between these nodes, anatomical or physiological or otherwise. And quick reminder that this has actually been around for far longer than many of you may realize. This is a connectivity matrix from 40 years ago by Barry Horowitz. So some of these ideas are not recent at all. So I've summarized here briefly the key dimensions, spatial, temporal, and topological, in network neuroscience. Now, each of those dimensions carries the potential for dependencies in the data. And if these dependencies are not taken into account, that might impact results, that might impact analyses. And to illustrate that, I have a few examples from each domain. So, for example, from the topological or connectivity domain, here you have a result showing a very strong positive relationship between the edge density of connectomes on the x-axis, that is the proportion of connections, of kind of possible connections that exist in the network. And on the y-axis you have the average clustering coefficient, which is the proportion of neighbors of a node that are themselves connected on average, so a measure of network segregation. And you see a very strong positive relationship, which is perhaps not surprising, given that the more connections, the more edges there are in a network, the more likely it is that the neighbors of a node are connected. But the point is that if you're unaware of this relationship, if you don't take it into account, and you're, for example, interested in the clustering coefficient as a feature of interest, and you're not aware of this, then your results may be driven by underlying differences in a simpler feature in the edge density. And null models are one way to kind of take this into account. An example from the temporal domain is temporal autocorrelation, or the fact that time series tend to be smooth over time, that neighboring time points in neural recordings more likely than not tend to have similar values. Finally, from the spatial domain, spatial autocorrelation, or the smoothness over space of neural maps, the fact that neighboring points in space tend to have similar values in neural maps. And again, all of these dependencies may impact results if not appropriately dealt with, and null models are one way to take these dependencies into account in analyses and to evaluate the extent to which they might contribute to our results. And you'll hear today from speakers discussing all of these domains and more. So our next two speakers, Andrew Zaleski and Rick Betzel, will talk about the topological or connectivity domain. Then Kolja Shafiei will speak about the temporal domain, followed by Justine Hansen discussing the spatial domain, and finally Arina Arnakevičiūtė will discuss implications of spatial dependencies as well as other dependencies for analysis of genetic data. So to motivate null models a little bit more and give a specific example, I'll illustrate the idea with an example from the topological or connectivity domain, which we'll hear a lot more about from our next two speakers. So I'm not going to go into great detail here. It's, again, just to illustrate and motivate the idea. So imagine you have access to a new connectome. It might be a connectome of a new species that's not been studied before. It might be the connectome of a kind of known species, but that's been reconstructed in unprecedented level of detail. And you might put this through your favorite toolbox for quantifying brain network organization and calculate some graph theoretical measures. For example, the average clustering coefficient that was mentioned previously, so the proportion of neighbors of a node that are themselves connected. And you find that this is 0.3. Okay? Then you might wonder, is this special, 0.3? Is this a lot, or is this very little? And could we get a similar value just by chance in a comparable network, which might have the same number of nodes and the same number of edges, but a random topology, random connectivity pattern? And actually we can test, this is a testable hypothesis that we can test using null models. And so again, this example is specific to the network domain, but applies to the other domains as well. Here we have a feature of interest, the clustering coefficient that we've calculated for our empirical network. And we want to benchmark this against a null population of networks. So in this case, we're interested in asking whether we could get a similar value in a network of the same size with random topology. And so we might preserve some attributes of the network, for example, the number of nodes and the number of edges, but we'll randomize some other properties, in this case the topology. So we'll randomize the pattern of connectivity, and we'll recalculate our feature for this random network. But doing this once is not enough, because every randomized instance of the network will be different. So we repeat this a number of times, say 10,000 times, to build a null distribution of our feature of interest. And we can then use this to benchmark our empirical value against this distribution. And we can use that as well to calculate a p-value, which is simply defined as the proportion of the null values which are more extreme than the empirical value. And in a case like this, where the empirical value falls somewhere near the middle of the distribution, the p-value would not be significant. In other words, the empirical value is not extreme relative to the distribution, and we would conclude in this specific example that the extent of clustering in our empirical network is due to the preserved attribute. So, in other words, the average clustering in that empirical network does arise simply as a function of the edge density. If we have a similar network with the same edge density but random connections, we get similar values of clustering on average. However, if our empirical value is extreme relative to the null distribution, and our p-value is significant, then we would conclude that our feature of interest is not due to the preserved attribute, but is due to the attribute that was randomized. In this example, the presence of clustering in that empirical network does not arise simply as a function of the density of the network, but it is related to the specific pattern of connections, to the specific topology. And that actually would be the case here. So what I've illustrated here is an example of a randomization-based null model, where we've taken our data and we've somehow shuffled the values around to generate a randomized instance. So in this case, for the network, we've taken maybe pairs of edges, we've swapped them around iteratively until we have a randomized connector. And this might come with some conditions or rules where we might only swap the edges if a certain condition holds. For example, if these edges are of similar length. And you'll hear a lot more about this from Andrew shortly. The other way to generate kind of nulls to benchmark our empirical values is using generative models, where we kind of build a reference network or data set from the ground up. In the case of a connectome network, we would often start with a small seed network with a few nodes and edges, and then progressively add nodes or edges to that according to some rule. So in this case, the probability of adding an edge might be proportional to a certain existing property of the seed network. And you'll hear a lot more about this from Rick Betzel in our third talk. I also want to emphasize that this idea of randomization versus generative approaches to kind of create reference networks to benchmark our data isn't specific only to connectomes, and it applies to the other domains as well. So often you can take your data, shuffle it in some way, or you can generate synthetic data according to some rules, according to some principles. Finally, there's a whole spectrum of null models, and it's really a very powerful approach. So here we have an empirical network. There's a whole range of null models we can implement. On one extreme, we can kind of preserve very little and randomize almost everything else. We could preserve multiple properties, or we could try and preserve as much as possible and actually change very little to have a sort of very strict benchmark. And so here is a whole spectrum of nulls where on the one extreme, where we've destroyed everything, we have a sort of straw man, where whatever we calculate about our empirical network is almost always going to be significant relative to this reference population where we've kind of mangled the data and destroyed everything. On the other extreme, I guess the opposite of a straw man is a steel woman. We have this kind of very robust reference where this might allow us to test very nuanced hypotheses about organization of our empirical data. And crucially, there is no right or wrong null model. It simply depends on your question, on your hypothesis. Potentially, it depends on your ability to have a suitable null, to be able to constrain a lot of properties or to have a generative model with the appropriate rules. But there is no right or wrong model. And a variable that someone might consider a confound for someone else might be a kind of their feature of interest, the thing they're interested in. So there's a lot of freedom to choose null models, both in terms of the kind of stringency, how many properties or rules you want to implement and preserve, and also which domain do you choose a null from, the topological, spatial, temporal domain, which is great. So there's a lot of power in these approaches. This freedom to choose also requires you to kind of carefully interpret the results relative to the assumptions and to the underlying constraints and rules that you have implemented. I want to briefly flag this list of some existing implementations of null models in various programming languages. This is available on my GitHub, and it's also available in this review paper. Shameless plug, I wrote this with Bratislav, and a lot of credit to him as well. This kind of summarizes most of what I've told you about just now and more. And you'll hear in a lot more detail from our upcoming speakers about these ideas, and you'll also hear about more than is contained within the paper. So you're actually learning a lot more by staying here than you would just by reading the paper. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be happy to take a few questions if you have any. Are there any questions? Yes.
Hi, thanks for mentioning it. So I was just wondering, if you clarify what exactly the null hypothesis is mathematically?
Yeah, so in this case, for example, this specific example, where we have some empirical feature, the clustering of our empirical network, and then we're preserving some properties and randomizing others. I suppose the null hypothesis would be that our feature of interest, x, arises simply as a function of the density of the network. So we've taken our network, we've kept the same number of nodes, same number of edges, we've shuffled the connections, and then the null hypothesis here is we've shuffled the patterns of connections, we'll get the similar amount of clustering on average in that shuffled population. And then the alternative hypothesis would be we will not kind of reproduce that feature of interest in our Null distribution, because it arises not as a function of the properties that were preserved, but of the properties that were randomized. I don't know if that was your question, though.
Yeah, what would be that? There seems to be a lot of ways of doing that. So I guess you would advise choosing one in advance rather than looking at lots.
Not necessarily, no. You could very well.
Otherwise, it would be
Yeah, I mean, you could choose multiple null models to see, because there's this kind of stringency spectrum, and you could test a whole range of rules or constraints to see the extent to which these might contribute to your feature of interest. If you're doing a lot of null models, potentially, yes, you might want to correct for multiple comparisons. There's a very nice paper which I had in the slides and took out, which does this systematically. It's cited in the review by Klim in 2014. And there are a few others where a kind of range of models is used. This is done a lot in the generative model framework as well, which you'll hear a lot more about. But I suppose often the appropriate choice of null model will depend, first of all, on the type of data you have. Is it a connectome? Is it a time series? Is it a spatial map? It's worth emphasizing these are also related. So often, you know, a map might have been generated from a time series or so. But yeah, the domain is one question, and then the second question is, what's your question, what's your hypothesis? But hopefully all of this will become much, much clearer in subsequent talks. I wanted to briefly motivate and illustrate the idea without going into too much detail, because I don't want to overlap with the talks that are coming up. Does that help? Yeah. Are there any more questions? Okay. So we're on time somehow. So far, so good. Our next speaker is Andrew Zaleski, who will be telling you about rewiring approaches to connectors. So please join me in welcoming him.